The wind howled through the rafters of the Mercer barn, rattling the stained glass windows imported all the way from Boston. Today was supposed to be the union of two powerful families in Silver Creek, Colorado, a merger of land and law. But the silence that fell over the congregation wasn't one of reverence. It was the suffocating quiet of a grave. Jackson Mercer, the toughest rancher in the territory, stood frozen at the altar, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. A single piercing scream from his 4-year-old son shattered the ceremony, stopping the priest mid-sentence. The boy wasn't looking at the woman in the white silk gown standing next to his father. He was pointing a trembling finger at a dirty, shackled woman scrubbing the floor in the back shadows. "Papa, that's my mama." The year was 1887, and the unrelenting sun had turned the once lush pastures of the Double M Ranch into a patchwork of cracked earth and dying grass. Jackson Mercer stood before the mirror in his master bedroom, adjusting the stiff collar of his dress shirt. He felt like a man walking to the gallows rather than an altar. Jackson was a man carved from granite and grief. At 32, he had the weathered look of someone who had lived 3 lifetimes. His eyes, usually a sharp, piercing blue, were dull today, shadowed by the brim of the black Stetson he held in his calloused hands. "You look handsome, Papa," a small voice piped up from the doorway. Jackson turned. Timothy, his 4-year-old son, stood there in a miniature version of Jackson's suit. The boy had his mother's unruly chestnut hair and soft chin. Looking at him was both a blessing and a curse. It was like seeing a ghost every single day. "Come here, Scout," Jackson said, his voice gravelly. He knelt on one knee, ignoring the creak of his stiff trousers. He straightened Timothy's bolo tie. "You ready to be the best man?" Timothy didn't smile. He looked at his boots. "Do I have to call her Mama Miss Victoria?" Jackson's jaw tightened. He took a breath, smelling the dust and old wood of the house he built with his own hands. "No, Timmy. You call her Miss Victoria. Nobody replaces your Mama. You know that." "But Mama went to the angels," Timmy whispered. "That she did." Jackson said the lie, tasting like ash in his mouth. He didn't believe in angels anymore. Not since the night the cabin at the North Ridge burned down 3 years ago. They never found a body, just the charred remains of Lillian's favorite locket in the ashes. The sheriff had declared her dead, consumed by the fire that raged hotter than hell itself. Jackson stood up, putting on his hat. He wasn't marrying Victoria Halloway for love. He was marrying her because her father, Mayor Halloway, held the deed to the Double M. The drought had crippled Jackson's cattle stock, and the bank conveniently owned by the Halloways was threatening foreclosure. Marrying Victoria was the only way to keep the land for Timothy. It was a business transaction wrapped in silk and lace. Downstairs, the house was buzzing. The Halloway family had spared no expense. They had turned the massive Mercer barn into a cathedral of flowers and ribbons. It was obscene, Jackson thought. The ranch was bleeding money, yet Victoria insisted on importing orchids from San Francisco. "Jackson, darling." Victoria's voice drifted up the stairs, shrill and demanding. "The guests are arriving. My father is growing impatient." Victoria Halloway was beautiful in the way a diamond is beautiful, cold hard and sharp enough to cut you. She had blonde ringlets and eyes that calculated the worth of everything they landed on. She didn't want Jackson. She wanted the Mercer name and the status of being the rancher's wife. She wanted to tame the wild stallion of Silver Creek. Jackson placed a hand on Timothy's shoulder. "Stay close to me, son. Let's get this over with." Outside, the heat was oppressive. Carriages lined the long driveway. The elite of Colorado had gathered judges, cattle barons, and politicians. They were here to witness the final defeat of Jackson Mercer, though they called it a wedding. As Jackson walked toward the barn, he saw a commotion near the service entrance. A wagon with iron bars had pulled up. It was a transport from the county workhouse. "What is this?" Jackson asked his foreman, a grizzled old man named Hank. Hank spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Mayor's orders, boss. He rented out some debt prisoners from the county to help with the serving and the cleanup. Said he didn't want to pay for real staff when the county owes him favors." Jackson's stomach turned. Debt prisoners. People who couldn't pay their taxes or fines, dragged into servitude until they worked it off. It was slavery, by another name legal in these parts, only because Holloway wrote the laws. "Keep them out of sight," Jackson muttered. "I don't want to see chains at my wedding." "Yes, sir," Hank said, tipping his hat. Jackson walked into the barn. The air was thick with perfume, masking the smell of hay and livestock. He took his place at the altar. Mayor Holloway, a rotund man with a red face and a mustache that twitched when he smiled, gave Jackson a nod that was more of a smirk. "I own you," that look said. The organist hired from Denver began to play. The doors swung open. Victoria appeared a vision in white lace, trailing a veil 10 feet long. The guests gasped in admiration. Jackson felt nothing. He looked down at Timothy standing beside him. The boy was trembling. "It's okay, Timmy," Jackson whispered. But Timmy wasn't looking at the bride. He was looking past the rows of guests toward the back of the barn, where the shadows were deep. The ceremony droned on. The priest, Father O'Malley, spoke of duty and obedience, words that Victoria had personally selected. Jackson answered with robotic, "I do's," his eyes fixed on a stain on the floorboard. "And do you, Victoria Holloway, take this man?" While the priest spoke, the back of the barn was a different world. The help the debt prisoners brought in by the mayor were silently moving crates of wine and clearing dropped handkerchiefs. They were dressed in grey rags, forbidden to make eye contact with the guests. Among them was a woman known only as Inmate 402. She was thin, her frame gaunt from years of malnutrition. Her hair, once a vibrant chestnut, was matted and hidden under a rough grey scarf. Dirt smudged her cheeks, and her hands were raw and blistered from scrubbing floors in the county jail. She kept her head down, terrifyingly obedient. If she looked up, the guards would strike her. She had learned that lesson well over the last 3 years. She didn't know who she was. The fire had taken her memory, along with her old life. She only knew the pain, the cold of the cell and the voice of the warden telling her she was a criminal. A drifter found looting a burning cabin. They called her Jane, but she didn't feel like a Jane. She was scrubbing a wine spill near the back pew on her hands and knees. The rough wood scraped her skin. The music at the front of the barn sounded like a dream, something from a life she might have imagined. Suddenly, a child giggled nervously. The sound hit her like a physical blow. It was a specific giggle, a hiccuping, bubbly sound. Her head snapped up, violating the first rule of the workhouse. Through the forest of legs and expensive silk dresses, she saw him. A small boy in a suit, fidgeting at the altar. Timmy. The name exploded in her mind. It wasn't a thought. It was an instinct. It was the air filling lungs that hadn't breathed in years. The fog in her brain, the thick grey wall of amnesia that had plagued her since she woke up in the jail infirmary, suddenly developed a crack. She saw the man next to him. The broad shoulders, the way he stood with his weight on his left leg. "Jackson." She gasped, dropping the scrub brush. The clatter was masked by the organ, but the guard standing near the door heard it. He stepped forward, raising his baton. "Get back to work, 402, the guard hissed. She didn't hear him. She was staring at the woman in white standing next to Jackson. The woman was holding Jackson's hand. A flash of memory seared her vision. A woman with blonde ringlets standing over her. A lantern falling. Fire. The smell of smoke. The blonde woman smiling as she locked the door from the outside. "No," the prisoner whispered. Her voice was rusty from disuse. The guard grabbed her shoulder, his fingers digging into her thin flesh. "I said, eyes down." She shoved him. It was a weak shove born of desperation, but it caught the guard off surprise. She scrambled to her feet, the chains on her ankles rattling loudly. The noise cut through the barn. Heads turned. The organist faltered, hitting a dissonant chord. At the altar, Timothy turned around completely. He squinted into the gloom of the barn's rear. The prisoner stepped out of the shadows into a shaft of sunlight filtering through the high windows. The light hit her face, dirty, scarred, but unmistakable to the eyes of a child who had cried for her every night for 3 years. Timothy's eyes went wide. He dropped the ring pillow. "Papa," Timothy said, his voice rising over the murmurs of the confused crowd. Jackson frowned, looking down. "Timmy, pick up the rings." Timothy ignored him. He raised a shaking hand, pointing directly at the woman in rags, who was now trembling, tears cutting tracks through the soot on her face. "Papa, that's my mama." The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if the world had stopped spinning. Victoria froze. Her smile, practiced and perfect, twitched at the corner. She didn't turn around immediately. She stared straight ahead at the crucifix, her face draining of color. Jackson looked at his son, confusion knitting his brows. "Timmy, what are you saying?" "Mama!" Timothy screamed this time, breaking into a run. He sprinted down the aisle, his small boots thumping against the wood. "Timmy, stop!" Jackson shouted. He abandoned his bride at the altar and chased after his son. The guests parted like the Red Sea, shocked whispers erupting into a roar. Timothy didn't stop until he reached the woman in grey. He didn't care about the dirt or the smell or the chains. He threw his arms around her legs, burying his face in her rags. "Mama, you came back. You came back." The woman fell to her knees, wrapping her shackled arms around the boy. She buried her face in his neck, sobbing with a sound that was pure, raw agony. "My baby, my sweet baby." Jackson skidded to a halt 10 feet away. He felt as though he had been punched in the gut. He stared at the woman. The hair was wrong, chopped short and filthy. The clothes were wrong. But the eyes, the tear-filled eyes, looking up at him over his son's head, were the same hazel-green eyes he had fallen in love with at the county fair 5 years ago. "Lillian," Jackson whispered. The name was a prayer and a plea. "Jackson," she croaked. The guard, realizing the situation was spiraling, stepped forward, baton raised. "Get away from the guests, you filth." "Sir." "I apologize. This prisoner is mental." Jackson moved faster than a striking rattlesnake. He crossed the distance in a single stride and backhanded the guard across the jaw. The man went down in a heap unconscious before he hit the floor. Jackson dropped to his knees. His hands hovered over her face, afraid to touch her, afraid she was a hallucination that would shatter. He brushed a thumb over her cheek, wiping away a smudge of coal dust. "You're dead," Jackson said, his voice breaking. "I buried you. I buried your locket." I don't know," Lillian stammered, clutching Timothy tightly. "I woke up in the jail. They told me I was a thief. They told me I had no name." "Who told you?" Jackson demanded, a dark fury beginning to simmer beneath his shock. "The sheriff. And him." Lillian's eyes darted toward the front of the barn. She wasn't looking at the priest. She was looking at Mayor Halloway. At the altar, Mayor Halloway was sweating profusely. He signaled to 3 of his deputies standing near the exits. "Arrest that woman. She's an escaped convict. She's dangerous." "Hold it," Jackson roared. He stood up, pulling Lillian and Timothy behind him. He reached into his tuxedo jacket. He wasn't wearing a gun belt. It was a wedding after all, but he had a derringer tucked in his inner pocket. He drew it, leveling the small barrel at the deputies. "Anyone touches my wife, they die today," Jackson declared. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of the barn. It was the voice of the man who had tamed the wildest land in the territory. Victoria finally turned around. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been dropped. She gathered her skirts and ran to her father. "Daddy, do something. This is a farce. She's lying. Mayor." Halloway shouted, his face purple. "That woman is insane. Look at her. Does that look like Lillian Mercer? Lillian Mercer is dead. This is a trick by my political enemies." The guests were murmuring loudly now. Some were standing up to get a better look. Jackson looked down at Lillian. "Show me," he whispered. "Show me the mark." Lillian nodded understanding. With trembling fingers, she pulled down the collar of her rag dress, exposing her left shoulder. There, just above the collarbone, was a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon. Jackson stared at it. He let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for 3 years. He turned back to the crowd, his eyes blazing with a cold, terrifying fire. "This is Lillian Mercer," Jackson announced. "My wife. And if she's alive, then who is in that grave?" He turned his gaze slowly to Victoria and the mayor. The realization was dawning on him, piece by horrifying piece. The foreclosure, the convenient marriage, the woman locked away in the county workhouse where no one would look for a dead woman. "Victoria," Jackson said, his voice dropping an octave. "Why is my wife in chains?" Victoria took a step back, faltering. I don't know what you're talking about, Jackson. She must be an imposter, a look-alike. She remembers," Lillian said, her voice gaining strength as she stood up, supported by Jackson. She pointed a shaking finger at Victoria. "I remember the lantern. I remember you at the door. You were wearing a blue riding habit. You said Jackson deserves a woman who can help him rise, not a ranch girl who holds him down." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The specific detail of the blue riding habit struck a chord. Everyone knew Victoria Halloway was famous for her blue riding velvet. "Liar!" Victoria shrieked, her composure shattering. "You filthy gutter rat!" "Sheriff!" Mayor Halloway bellowed. "Arrest them! Arrest Jackson Mercer for brandishing a weapon!" Sheriff Barron, a man who had been in Halloway's pocket for a decade, stepped forward, his hand on his revolver. "Now, Jackson, put the pea-shooter down. Let's not have a bloodbath at a wedding." "There's no wedding, Barron," Jackson spat. "There's just a kidnapping and an attempted murder." "That's for a judge to decide," Barron said, unhooking his gun. "And right now you're threatening an officer of the law." The tension in the room was pulled tight as a bowstring. Jackson had 2 bullets. There were 5 deputies, plus the sheriff. Suddenly, The barn doors at the very back behind where Lillian had been scrubbing creaked open. A tall figure, silhouetted against the blinding afternoon sun, stepped in. He walked with a heavy limp, leaning on a cane, but his presence commanded immediate attention. He wore a dusty, long coat and a flat-brimmed hat. "I believe," the stranger's voice boomed deep and resonant, "that I might have some evidence regarding this matter." Mayor Holloway squinted. "Who the devil are you?" The man stepped into the light. He was older, with silver hair and a scar running down his cheek. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather-bound ledger. "My name is Arthur Penhaligon," the man said. "I was the clerk at the county jail for 10 years, until the mayor fired me last week for asking too many questions about inmate 402. The mayor's face went from purple to ghost white. "And this," Arthur said, holding up the book, "is the ledger proving that Mayor Holloway paid the warden $50 a month to keep a Jane Doe in solitary confinement and heavily sedated. The dates start exactly 3 days after the Mercer cabin fire." The revelation of the ledger hit the room like a physical shockwave. Arthur Penhaligon stood his ground, though his hand gripping the cane trembled slightly. He was a man of ink and paper. Not violence, but he had seen enough cruelty in the Holloway administration to rot a man's soul. "Give me that book," Mayor Holloway screamed, his voice cracking. "Sheriff, that man is stealing county property. Shoot him." Sheriff Barron hesitated. Shooting a rancher was one thing. Shooting an unarmed elderly clerk in front of the state's elite was another. "Mayor, there are witnesses. I don't care. It's all lies." Holloway lunged forward, his face contorted with panic. He wasn't reaching for the sheriff. He was reaching for the gun tucked in the sheriff's belt. "Look out!" Hank the foreman shouted from the side. Jackson didn't wait. He shoved Lillian and Timothy behind the heavy oak altar. As the mayor wrestled the gun free, a shot rang out. The bullet shattered a stained glass window high above, raining colored shards of glass down onto the wedding guests. Pandemonium erupted. Ladies in fine silk screamed and dove under pews. Men overturned chairs, scrambling for the exits. But the exits were blocked by the mayor's confused deputies. "Arthur!" "The book!" Jackson yelled over the din. Arthur Penhaligon, showing surprising agility for a man with a bad leg, slid the leather-bound ledger across the floorboards. It spun across the polished wood, stopping at Jackson's boots. Jackson snatched it up, jamming it into his belt. "Get them!" Holloway shrieked, waving the revolver wildly. "Kill them all if you have to burn the barn." Victoria grabbed her father's arm. "Daddy, are you insane? You can't burn the barn. I'm in here." Holloway backhanded his daughter, sending her sprawling into the flower arrangements. "You stupid girl. You let her live. You were supposed to ensure she never woke up. If this gets out, we hang." Jackson saw the madness in Holloway's eyes. This wasn't just a corrupt politician anymore. This was a cornered animal. "Hank!" Jackson bellowed. "Get the boys!" Hank, who had been standing by the service entrance, whistled sharply. The Mercer ranch hands, rough men, who loyalty lay with the brand, not the town, kicked open the side doors. They weren't dressed for a wedding. They were dressed for work, and they carried Winchesters. The standoff froze the room. On one side, the mayor and 5 nervous deputies. On the other, Jackson, his family, and a dozen angry cowboys. And in the middle, 300 terrified socialites towering on the floor. "Nobody shoots," shouted a booming voice from the front row. Judge Thaddeus Ross, the most feared circuit judge in the territory, stood up slowly. He brushed dust from his knees. "Holloway, put the gun down. You have turned a wedding into a war zone. "You have no authority here, Ross," Holloway spat. "This is my town. And this is my courtroom now," Jackson growled. He grabbed a heavy candelabra and hurled it at the deputies blocking the main door. "Everyone out now." The distraction worked. The guests stampeded toward the opening. In the chaos, Jackson grabbed Lillian's arm. "We have to move. The loft. We can hold them off from the high ground." "I can't run fast." Lillian wept, the chains on her ankles clanking. "Jackson, leave me. Take Timmy. I'm just slowing you down." Jackson stopped looking deep into her eyes. He grabbed the chain connecting her ankles. With a grunt of exertion that made the veins in his neck bulge, he didn't break the chain. He picked her up. He hoisted his wife into his arms, chains and all. "I left you once because I thought you were gone," Jackson said fiercely. "I am never leaving you again." He ran toward the ladder of the hayloft, Timmy clinging to his jacket as bullets began to splinter the wood around them. The hayloft was dark and smelled of dry grass and old dust. It was a fortress of solitude above the chaos below. Jackson kicked the ladder away as soon as they were up, leaving them isolated on the upper platform. Below the barn was empty of guests, now leaving only the mayor, his men, and the Mercer ranch hands engaged in a tense standoff near the entrance. Jackson pulled Lillian and Timmy behind a stack of hay bales. He checked his derringer. 1 bullet left. He cursed silently. "Let me see the chains," Jackson said, his voice gentle now. He examined the iron cuffs around Lillian's ankles. They were crude, rusted things. He pulled a multi-tool knife from his pocket, something he always carried for ranch work, and began working on the pin of the lock. "Does it hurt?" Timmy asked, his small fingers touching the red, raw skin on his mother's wrists. "Not anymore, baby," Lillian whispered, pulling Timmy into her lap. She rocked him, her tears soaking his hair. "Not now that I have you." Jackson worked the lock, his heart breaking with every scratch he saw on her skin. "I'm sorry, Lillian. God, I'm so sorry. I should have looked harder. I should have torn the jail apart. You couldn't know," Lillian said softly. Her memory was coming back in jagged pieces, sharp and painful. "I remember waking up in the dark. My head hurt so bad. I didn't know my name. I just knew I was afraid. The warden, he called me nothing. He said I was trash found on the road. Arthur said you were there for 3 years, Jackson said, the lock finally clicking open. He threw the heavy chains into the hay. 3 years they stole from us. Victoria came to visit, Lillian said, her voice trembling. Once a month? She would stand outside the cell. She wore a veil so I wouldn't see her face clearly, but I remember her voice. She would ask the warden, "Does she remember yet?" And when he said no, she would laugh. She said she was building a perfect life on my grave. Jackson's grip on the knife tightened until his knuckles turned white. She knew. She orchestrated the fire. The fire. Lillian flinched. I was cooking. She came to the door. She said she wanted to talk about a truce, about the water rights. I let her in. She hit me from behind. The last thing I saw was her kicking over the kerosene lamp. Below them, the mayor's voice echoed up from the floor. Jackson, I know you're up there. Give me the ledger and we can work this out. I can forgive the disruption. We can make a deal. Jackson crawled to the edge of the loft and peered down. Holloway was using Victoria as a shield standing behind a pillar. The only deal I'm making is with the hangman, Jackson shouted down. I have the ledger. Holloway, I see the entries. Payment to Warden Smith. Silence. Payment to arsonist, North Ridge job. It's all here. You can't prove I wrote that. I can prove it. Arthur Penhaligon's voice came from outside. He had managed to slip out with the guests, but was shouting through a crack in the barn door. I kept the originals, Halloway. You only burned the copies. Damn you, Halloway fired a shot blindly at the door. Inside the loft, Timmy started to cry. Papa, I'm scared. Lillian grabbed Jackson's hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Jackson, look at the back window. The hay hoist. Jackson looked. At the rear of the loft, there was a large loading door used to hoist hay bales up from wagons. It was 30 feet off the ground, but there was a pulley system with a thick rope. If we can get down there, Lillian whispered, we can get to the stables. We can get horses. It's risky, Jackson said. If they see us, we can't stay here, she said, her eyes hard. He's going to burn the barn, Jackson. He did it once. He'll do it again. Look. Jackson sniffed the air. Smoke. Below near the entrance, one of the deputies was pouring oil onto the spilled hay. Halloway wasn't bluffing. He was going to incinerate the evidence and the witnesses. The madman, Jackson breathed. He's going to burn the whole ranch down. The smell of disaster hit them first, acrid, choking, and terrifyingly familiar. Thick, oily coils of black smoke began to curl up toward the rafters, licking at the dry wood of the loft like the tongues of starving beasts. The hay stored in the barn, seasoned by the summer heat, was no longer feed for livestock. It was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. And below them, Mayor Halloway had just struck the match. Hank, Jackson bellowed, his voice raw as he leaned over the edge of the loft. Get the men out. He's lighting the fire. Get them out now. Below, the scene dissolved into chaos. The Mercer ranch hands, realizing the insane escalation from a wedding brawl to an execution, abandoned their positions. They dragged the unconscious guard out the side doors, coughing as the first wave of heat rolled over them. The barn was now a trap, a wooden cage rapidly turning into an oven. Come on, Jackson ordered, his face grim. We can't go down the ladder. The fire is already climbing the posts. He rushed Lillian and Timothy to the back of the loft. The air up here was already growing hot, the oxygen thinning. He kicked the latch of the heavy loading doors. They groaned in protest before swinging outward, revealing the blindingly bright afternoon sky. The drop was steep, 30 feet of nothing but hard-packed earth below. Jackson grabbed the heavy hemp rope of the pulley system used to hoist winter feed. He tested it with a sharp tug. The beam above creaked, but it held. Lillian, Jackson said, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that burned brighter than the fire below. We have to do this. Hold Timmy. Wrap your legs around my waist. Do not let go. Lillian looked down at the dizzying drop, then back at the smoke billowing behind them. Fear was etched into her features, the same fear he had seen in the eyes of untamed horses. But underneath it was a bedrock of trust. The rope won't hold all of us, she whispered, clutching Timmy so tight her knuckles were white. It holds pine bales of hay, Jackson insisted, winding the thick, rough rope around his left arm to create friction. It will hold us. I won't let you fall. Not again. He didn't give her time to argue. He pulled her against him. Lillian wrapped her free arm around his neck, sandwiching a terrified Timothy between their chests. Jackson stepped onto the ledge, his boots finding purchase on the very edge of the precipice. Hold on! Jackson kicked off into the void. Gravity took them instantly. The rope hissed as it tore through the pulley, biting into Jackson's forearm through his jacket. He gritted his teeth, using every ounce of his strength to break their descent, fighting the momentum that wanted to smash them into the ground. The friction burned his skin, searing him, but he refused to loosen his grip. They hit the dirt hard. The impact jarred Jackson's bones, rattling his teeth. He took the brunt of the fall, his knees buckling as he rolled backward to absorb the shock, keeping Lillian and Timmy shielded in his embrace. Dust plumed around them, choking and thick. "Papa!" Timmy cried out, his voice high and trembling. Jackson groaned, pulse radiating through his shoulder, but he scrambled up instantly. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded his veins. "I'm okay. Everyone up. Run to the stables." Behind them, the barn erupted. A sudden whoosh of oxygen fed the smoldering piles of hay, and the structure transformed into a towering inferno. The stained glass windows, imported with such vanity by the Halloways, blew out from the pressure raining molten lead and glass into the yard. The heat was physical, a solid wall pushing them forward. They sprinted across the yard, lungs burning. They reached the entrance of the stables just as Sheriff Barron and 3 deputies rounded the corner of the burning barn, their faces smeared with soot weapons drawn. "Stop right there!" Barron shouted, leveling his Winchester rifle. "Don't move a muscle, Mercer!" Jackson skidded to a halt. There was nowhere to go. The open range was behind the sheriff, and the burning barn was behind Jackson. He shoved Lillian and Timmy into the nearest horse stall and turned, planting his feet wide. He had no bullets left in the Derringer. He was armed with nothing but his rage and his body. "Don't do it, Barron," Jackson warned, his voice low and dangerous. "You're a lawman, not an executioner. Don't die for Halloway's sins." "I got orders, Mercer," Barron said, though the barrel of his rifle wavered. He was sweating his eyes, darting from Jackson to the inferno raging just 50 yards away. "I can't let you leave." "Then you'll have to shoot me in cold blood," Jackson said, stepping forward. "Because I am not going back in a cage, and neither is she." Barron tightened his finger on the trigger. The silence stretched, broken only by the roar of the fire and the terrified whinnying of the horses in the stable. Jackson braced himself for the impact. Crack! A gunshot rang out, sharp, sudden, and deafening. But Jackson didn't fall. Across the yard, Sheriff Barron yelped, dropping his rifle. He clutched his right hand, staring in shock at the blood welling between his fingers. His weapon lay in the dust, the stock shattered. Jackson spun around, looking toward the main ranch gate. Through the haze of smoke and heat, a rider emerged like a phantom. She sat atop a massive black stallion, her silhouette cut sharp against the sun. It was Widow Claire, the recluse, who lived in the canyon. People said she was crazy, people said she was a witch, but everyone knew she was the best shot in the territory. She lowered a smoking long-range buffalo rifle, her expression unreadable beneath the brim of her hat. "I reckon," Claire called out, her voice calm and carrying effortlessly over the chaos, "that shooting an unarmed man and a woman in front of a child is bad for one's health, especially in my county." "This is police business, Claire," Barron screamed, cradling his hand. "Back off." "Look behind me, Sheriff," Claire replied coolly. More riders appeared through the gate, flanking the widow. It wasn't just the Mercer ranch hands. It was the townspeople, the blacksmith with his heavy hammer resting on his saddle horn, the grocer holding a shotgun, the school teacher, the people of Silver Creek who had been bled dry by Halloway's taxes, intimidated by Barron's deputies, and silenced for years. They had seen the smoke. They had heard the shots. And they had finally had enough. Judge Thaddeus Ross rode forward on a white mare, his judicial robes replaced by a dusty coat, but his authority undiminished. "Barron, drop your weapons, all of you, now." The deputies looked at the angry mob of armed citizens. They looked at their wounded sheriff. They looked at the inferno consuming the barn. One by one, the revolvers hit the dirt. "It's over." Jackson breathed, his shoulders sagging slightly. But it wasn't. A guttural scream tore from the side of the burning barn. The side door crashed open, engulfed in flames, and a figure stumbled out into the yard. It was Mayor Holloway. He looked like a demon birthed from the fire. His fine tuxedo was singed and smoking, his face blackened with soot. His eyes wid with a feral, terrified madness. He was coughing violently, dragging a screaming woman by the hair. "Victoria." "I won't go back," Holloway shrieked, his voice cracking. "I built this town. I own every inch of this dirt. I own you all." He held a long, serrated hunting knife to Victoria's throat. His own daughter. She was sobbing hysterically, her white wedding dress torn and grey with ash, her legs dragging in the dust. "Daddy, please," Victoria begged, clawing at his arm. "Let me go. I did everything you asked. I lied for you." "You failed," Holloway snarled, shaking her like a rag doll. "You let her live. You were supposed to be the perfect face. Now look at us." He swung the knife toward the crowd, backing away toward the horses. "Back off, or she dies. I mean it." The mob froze. Even Widow Claire hesitated, her finger hovering over the trigger. A headshot was impossible with Victoria flailing in front of him. Jackson stepped forward, his hands empty, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. The rage that had been a roaring fire earlier had cooled into something sharper, harder. "Let her go, Holloway. There is nowhere to run. The fire has burned it all down." "I need a horse," Holloway demanded, spittle flying from his mouth. "And safe passage to the border. Give me a horse, Mercer, or your bride-to-be bleeds out right here." "She's not my bride," Jackson said coldly. "No," a voice said from the shadows of the stable. "She's his accomplice." Lillian stepped out. She walked past Jackson, moving into the open yard. She didn't flinch at the heat. She didn't look at the guns. She walked with a spine of steel, the chains gone, the fear gone. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like the mistress of the Double M Ranch. "Lillian, stay back," Jackson warned, reaching for her. She ignored him. She walked until she was 10 paces from the man who had stolen 3 years of her life. "You don't get safe passage," Lillian said, her voice clear and resonant, cutting through the roar of the fire. "You get what you gave me." Holloway sneered, though his grip on the knife slipped slightly due to sweat. You're nothing. You're a ghost. A dirt farmer's wife who should have died in that fire." "I am a mother," Lillian said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of every night she had spent weeping in the dark. She stopped. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into the deep pocket of her ragged dress. Her hand closed around something she had scooped up from the barn floor, before they jumped a handful of ash soot and the earth of the ranch floor. "And this, she said, her eyes locking onto his, "is for the fire." She threw the mixture. It wasn't a weapon, not really. It was a cloud of grit and ash, a symbolic rejection. But the wind caught it, and it struck Holloway squarely in the face. The ash coated his eyes, blinding him instantly. Holloway roared in pain and surprise, his hands flying to his face to claw at the grit. The knife clattered to the ground. Victoria screamed and scrambled away on her hands and knees, retching in the dirt, crawling toward the safety of the judge. Jackson didn't hesitate. He launched himself forward. He hit Holloway like a freight train. They went down hard, rolling in the dust. Holloway flailed, striking out blindly, scratching and biting like a cornered rat. But Jackson was younger, stronger, and fueled by a grief so profound it felt like infinite power. Jackson pinned the mare to the ground. He straddled his chest, his fist raising for the strike. He punched Holloway in the jaw once, twice. The sound of bone cracking echoed in the yard. Holloway went limp, blood pouring from his nose, but Jackson pulled back his fist again. He wanted to finish it. He wanted to end the man who had made his son cry for a mother he couldn't remember. The red haze of violence clouded his vision. "Kill him," the voice in his head whispered. "End it." "Jackson, no." Lillian's voice pierced the fog. Jackson froze, his knuckles split and bleeding, hovering inches from Holloway's ruined face. He was panting, his chest heaving. He looked up. Lillian was standing over him. She wasn't looking at Holloway. She was looking at Jackson. Her eyes were pleading. "Don't let him turn you into a killer," Lillian said, placing a gentle hand on Jackson's trembling shoulder. "He's not worth your soul, Jackson. He's not worth the man you are for Timmy." Jackson stared at her. He looked at his son peeking out from the stable door. He looked at the blood on his hands. Slowly the tension left his body. He lowered his fist. "Let the law take him," Lillian whispered. "Let him rot in the dark. Let him feel every second of the time he stole." Jackson took a ragged breath. He stood up, towering over the broken, weeping figure of the mare. He spat into the dust next to Holloway's head. He turned to Sheriff Barron, who was being bandaged by the town doctor. Jackson's voice was devoid of emotion. "Sheriff," Jackson said, "arrest him." 2 weeks had passed since the inferno at the Mercer barn, and the world had changed. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the relentless, scorching sun was hidden behind a thick curtain of grey clouds. The drought that had choked Silver Creek, turning the pastures into brittle graveyards of dust and despair, had finally broken. Jackson Mercer sat on the wide wooden swing of his front porch, a ceramic mug of steaming coffee cradled in his hands. He wasn't drinking it. He was simply holding it for the warmth, watching the rain fall. It wasn't a violent storm, but a steady, soaking downpour, the kind that healed the earth. He watched as the water carved tiny rivers through the dust in the yard, washing away the soot and the memories of the fire. The smell was intoxicating, a mix of wet sagebrush, damp pine, and the metallic tang of ozone. It was the scent of a new beginning. The screen door behind him groaned on its hinges, a familiar, comforting sound that he hadn't realized he'd missed so desperately. Jackson didn't turn immediately. He just listened to the soft fall of footsteps on the floorboards. They were light, hesitant, but free. No clanking of iron chains. No shuffling of shackles. Lillian stepped out into the cool morning air. She didn't look like the broken, nameless inmate from the workhouse anymore. The grime of the cell and the ash of the fire had been scrubbed away, revealing the woman underneath. Her chestnut hair was still short, a jagged reminder of her captivity, but it was clean now, soft and framing her face. She wore a simple dress of blue calico that matched the clearing skies, a stark contrast to the grey rags she had worn for 3 years. She moved to the railing, taking a deep breath of the wet air, her eyes closing as the mist touched her face. Jackson watched her, his chest tightening. She was thinner than he remembered, and there were shadows under her eyes that might never fully fade. But she was here. She was real. "Is he finally down?" Jackson asked softly, his voice rough with the morning quiet. Lillian opened her eyes and offered a tired, gentle smile. She moved to the swing, tucking her legs beneath her skirt as she sat beside him. He's sleeping. Finally. It took an hour. He refuses to let go of my hand until his breathing changes. He thinks if he closes his eyes without holding on, I'll vanish into smoke again. Jackson shifted, wrapping his arm around her shoulders, pulling her solid warmth against his side. We aren't vanishing, Lily. We're rooted here, like the old oaks down by the creek. Nothing is moving us again. Lillian leaned her head on his shoulder, her hand instinctively finding his free one. Her fingers traced the calluses on his palm, grounding herself. Arthur came by earlier while you were checking the fence line, she said quietly. He brought the newspapers from Denver. Jackson stiffened slightly. What did they say? It's over, Jackson. Truly over. She whispered, her voice gaining a thread of steel. Judge Ross didn't waste time. Mayor Holloway and Warden Smith were sentenced yesterday. Life in the territorial prison. No parole. They're going to the very hell they built for me. And Victoria. Jackson asked the name, tasting like bile. Exile, Lillian replied. She testified against her father to save her own neck. In exchange for immunity, she has to leave Colorado. She's being sent east to live with a distant aunt in a boarding house. For a woman like her, stripped of her name and her fortune fading into obscurity, is a punishment worse than a cell. Good riddance. Jackson grunted, the tension in his shoulders finally beginning to unspool. She can rot in the east for all I care. But what about the ranch? The foreclosure notice? Lillian shifted so she could look him in the eye. A spark of triumph, bright and fierce, lit up her gaze. That was the best part. Judge Ross went through the ledger Arthur saved. The debt on the double M. It was fabricated, Jackson. Holloway was skimming interest off the bank loans and falsifying the records to force you into that marriage. We don't owe the bank a single dime. We own the ranch. Free and clear. Jackson let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 3 years. He set his coffee cup down on the floorboards and ran a hand through his hair. A laugh bubbled up in his chest, a rusty, unfamiliar sound that felt surprisingly good. He looked out at the rain, soaking his thirsty pastures. The grass would grow back green and lush. The cattle would fatten. The double M would survive. But land was just dirt without the people to share it with. He turned his full attention back to Lillian. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was heavy with the things they had lost and the miracle of what they had found. Jackson reached into the pocket of his vest. His fingers brushed against velvet, and he pulled out a small drawstring pouch. I found this, Jackson said, his voice dropping to a whisper. About a week after the fire at the North Ridge cabin, I was sifting through the ashes looking for anything left of you. Lillian's breath hitched as he opened the pouch. It wasn't the massive, cold diamond he had placed on Victoria's finger during the sham ceremony. It was a simple gold band, the gold dulled and darkened by intense heat. It was slightly dented on one side, bearing the marks of the inferno that had consumed their home. I kept it, Jackson confessed, staring at the ring. I kept it in my pocket every day for 3 years. I told myself it was to remember you by, but I think a part of me knew. I think my soul knew yours was still on this earth. I couldn't throw it away. Lillian's hands trembled as she reached out. She touched the scorched metal, her eyes filling with tears. It's not shiny anymore, she whispered. It's burned. It's got scars. It's been through the fire, Jackson said fiercely, taking her left hand in his. "It's been beaten and burned and buried in the dirt. But it's still gold. Lillian, it didn't break." He looked deep into her eyes, seeing the strength that had kept her alive in the dark. "It's like us. We've got scars now. We aren't the same people we were when we first married. We're stronger." Lillian nodded, a tear escaping and tracking down her cheek. "Put it on me, Jackson." Jackson's hands, usually so steady with a rifle or a rope, shook slightly as he slid the damaged ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, settling into the groove it had made years ago. "Lillian Mercer," Jackson said, his voice thick with an emotion that threatened to choke him. "I promise to protect you from the dark. I promise to believe in you even when the whole world says you're gone. Will you stay with me through the drought and the flood?" "I'm already home, Jackson," she whispered. "I never really left." She leaned in, bridging the gap between them. When their lips met, it wasn't the tentative, polite kiss of their first courtship. It was a kiss of survival. It tasted of salt and rain and a desperate, consuming love that had defied death itself. It was a promise that no matter how hot the fire burned, they would not be consumed. Inside the house, in the warm safety of his bedroom, Timothy stirred. He blinked open his eyes, panic rising in his chest for a fleeting second when he felt the empty space beside him. He sat up, clutching his blanket, and looked toward the window. Through the glass, he saw them. His papa and his mama sitting on the swing, wrapped in each other's arms, while the rain washed the world clean. The fear in his chest evaporated, replaced by a warm, heavy comfort. They were there. They were safe. Timothy smiled, a true, sleepy smile. He lay back down, buried his face in the pillow that smelled like lavender and safety, and closed his eyes. The nightmare was finally over. That day at the Double M Ranch proved that the truth, no matter how deep you bury it, will always find a way to the light. Lillian Mercer wasn't saved by a prince or a knight. She was saved by the unbreakable bond of a child's love and a husband who refused to let go. Jackson and Lillian rebuilt their life not on the lies of the Halloways, but on the solid ground of their endurance. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and share it with someone you love. It really helps the channel grow and lets us bring you more emotional stories like this one. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Did you cry when Timmy recognized his mom? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.